The ground beneath one of California's most popular ski resorts has been rising for over 40 years. And it hasn't stopped. Not an inch here or there. The center of an entire volcanic basin, more than 100 square miles of it, has swelled upward by nearly 3 feet since scientists first started measure. Ing it. And it's still going. This isn't a slow-motion natural disaster building towards some inevitable eruption next week. It's something stranger and, in its own way, more unsettling. A volcano that has been visibly, measurably inflating for 4 decades without erupting at all, sitting directly beneath a town of thousands of full-time residents. And a mountain that welcomes over 1 million visitors every single year. Today we're breaking down exactly what's rising beneath Mammoth Mountain, why scientists have been watching it so closely since 1980, and why the invisible gas that's already killed people, there's just the most visible symptom of something enormous still happening deep underground. Here's what makes this story genuinely different from a typical volcano warning. This isn't a mountain scientists are worried might wake up. It's a volcanic system that never fully went back to sleep in the first place, one that has been in a documented, measurable state of unrest for longer than most of the people skiing on it right now have been alive. And the strangest part is how ordinary everything looks on the surface. Chairlifts run, restaurants serve lunch, families take ski lessons, all of it happening directly on top of a slowly rising dome that scientists have been tracking with the same seriousness they'd apply to a system that erupted last year. Let's start with the sheer scale of what we're actually talking about, because most people who visit Mammoth Mountain have no idea they're standing inside one of the largest volcanic structures in North America. Mammoth Mountain isn't really a standalone volcano in the way most people picture one. It sits directly on the southwestern rim of Long Valley Caldera, an enormous oval-shaped volcanic basin measuring roughly 10 miles by 19 miles, formed roughly 760,000 years ago in one of the most violent eruptions in the geologic history of North America. That eruption expelled more than 140 cubic miles of volcanic material, the Bishop Tuff, an eruption so massive that the ground above the emptying magma chamber literally collapsed inward, leaving behind the vast depression that still defines this landscape today. For context, an eruption of that scale dwarfs essentially anything in recorded human history, and it's part of why volcanologists categorize Long Valley alongside places like Yellowstone as one of the significant caldera systems in the country capable, at least in the deep geologic past, of eruptions on a scale most people struggle to fully comprehend. The comparison to Yellowstone is genuinely worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes how most people think about which American volcanoes actually deserve close attention. Yellowstone dominates popular imagination as the country's premier supervolcano threat, largely thanks to decades of documentaries and viral speculation about an overdue eruption. Long Valley is smaller in overall footprint, but it belongs to the same fundamental category of volcanic system, a large caldera formed by a catastrophic, chamber-emptying eruption, still capable of significant unrest long after the original event. And unlike Yellowstone, which sits in a comparatively remote stretch of Wyoming visited mostly during summer months, Long Valley Caldera hosts a genuine year-round town, a major commercial ski resort, and a stretch of Highway 395 that tens of thousands of travelers drive through every single week, mostly without ever realizing they've entered the footprint of a caldera capable of forming one of the largest eruptions in the continent's geologic history. For hundreds of thousands of years after that cataclysmic eruption, the caldera did what calderas generally do between major events. It sat there, its resurgent dome, the central portion of the caldera floor that gets pushed back upward by pressure from below, slowly rising by roughly 1,600 feet over the millennia since the original collapse, punctuated by smaller eruptions around the margins at various points over the following several 100,000 years, the most recent of which occurred within roughly the past few hundred years at nearby volcanic vents. Then, in 1978, something changed, a magnitude 5. 4 earthquakes struck about 6 miles southeast of the caldera, ending nearly 2 decades of relative seismic calm across the region. It turned out to be the opening note of something much larger. In May of 1980, an intense swarm of earthquakes struck the southern margin of the caldera, including 4 separate magnitude 6 earthquakes, 3 of which hit on the very same day. In the immediate aftermath, USGS scientists rushed to re-examine the area and found something that changed how they understood what was actually happening beneath their feet. The center of the caldera had physically risen by nearly a foot since the previous summer, after decades of measured stability. This was the unmistakable signature of magma moving beneath the surface, and it marked the beginning of a period of ongoing volcanic unrest that, remarkably, continues in some form to this day, more than 4 decades later. Here's the number that should genuinely put this in perspective. By early the following decade, continued measurements showed the resurgent dome had swollen by nearly 2.5 feet, affecting an area of more than 100 square miles of the caldera floor. Scientific analysis, combining gravity and precise ground position data, confirmed what researchers had suspected: that silicic magma, a thick, gas-rich type of molten rock associated with historically explosive eruptions, was actually intruding into the crust beneath the caldera. This wasn't a subtle, ambiguous signal buried in noisy data. It was a measurable, physical swelling of the ground itself, happening across an area larger than many entire towns. And it was happening because something molten was pushing upward from below. The U.S. Geological Survey responded by launching one of the most intensive volcano monitoring efforts in the country, installing an expanded seismometer network in 1982, specifically to track earthquake activity across the caldera and the adjacent Mono Inyo volcanic chain in extraordinary detail. That monitoring network has run continuously ever since, and what it has recorded over the following decades tells a genuinely remarkable story of a volcanic system that refuses to simply settle back down. Since 1980, typical background activity in the Long Valley area has included as many as 20 small earthquakes a day, magnitude 2 or smaller, occasional swarms of magnitude 3, and larger events strong enough to be felt locally, and continued uplift of the caldera's center at a rate of roughly an inch per year during active periods, with swarms including magnitude 4 earthquakes occurring roughly once annually. This isn't a system that erupted once, went quiet, and now sits as a historical curiosity. It's a system that has stayed measurably, continuously active for the entirety of most people's adult lives. The unrest hasn't been perfectly steady the entire time, and understanding its actual rhythm matters, for understanding why scientists remain so genuinely engaged with monitoring it. Following the initial dramatic swelling of the early 1980s, the caldera experienced a period of relative quiescence from roughly 2000 through 2011, a stretch calm enough that USGS scientists specifically noted the challenge of reminding an evolving local population, many of whom hadn't lived through the dramatic uplift of the 1980s and 1990s, that the underlying hazards from that earlier unrest hadn't actually gone away, just paused. Then, starting in 2011, the resurgent dome began rising again, with renewed uplift running through at least 2014, accompanied by an uptick in low-level earthquake activity, both within the caldera itself and specifically beneath Mammoth Mountain. And the story hasn't ended there either. Recent reporting drawing on continued USGS monitoring confirms that the caldera has kept bulging in the years since, with total uplift across these repeated episodes now totaling somewhere around 83 centimeters, nearly 3 feet, measured from the resurgent dome's baseline position before the unrest began in the late 1970s. The USGS response to the 1980 unrest wasn't purely scientific either, and the human, economic side of this story is genuinely worth understanding on its own terms. In 1982, in direct response to the ongoing seismicity and uplift, the USGS issued what was, at the time, an unprecedented step, a formal notice of potential volcanic hazard covering the Long Valley area. The first notice of its kind ever issued under the agency's then new hazard notification procedures. The announcement triggered genuine, immediate anxiety in the local community. Property values in Mammoth Lakes reportedly dipped in the wake of the notice. Some residents and business owners publicly criticized what they viewed as an alarmist announcement disproportionate to the actual immediate risk, and the episode became something of a landmark case study in the broader, ongoing challenge of communicating genuine, but slow-moving and highly uncertain, scientific hazard information to a community whose economic livelihood depends heavily on tourists feeling safe enough to visit. That tension between honest scientific transparency and the very real economic consequences of how hazard information gets communicated and received has shaped the relationship between USGS scientists and the Mammoth Lakes community for more than 4 decades since, and it's part of why the agency has increasingly emphasized ongoing public engagement, including the community field trips mentioned earlier, over the kind of single dramatic announcement that characterized the 1982 notice. This is precisely where the invisible gas hazard that's already claimed lives at Mammoth Mountain connects directly back to this much larger, slower-moving story happening beneath the entire caldera. The carbon dioxide that killed a cross-country skier in 1998 and 3 ski patrollers in 2006 isn't some isolated freak phenomenon unrelated to everything else happening in this volcanic system. It's a direct, physical byproduct of the exact same magma whose movement triggered the 1980 earthquake swarm in the first place. When that magma rose closer to the surface as a dike beneath Mammoth Mountain during the 1989 to 1990 earthquake swarm, specifically tied to the mountain itself, it cracked open new pathways for gas that had been accumulating for far longer to finally reach the surface in concentrated lethal amounts. In other words, the dead trees around Horseshoe Lake and the tragedy that killed 3 ski patrollers in 2006 aren't a separate story from the caldera's decades of measured uplift and earthquake swarms. They're the most visible, most tangible, most human evidence that the magma responsible for all of that broader unrest is genuinely still there, degassing beneath the surface, close enough to actively poison the soil above it. Scientists studying the system have worked hard to understand exactly what's driving this decades-long pattern of uplift and seismicity, and the honest answer is that even the experts don't fully agree on every detail. One line of research, drawing on gravity data and deformation modeling, points toward genuine intrusions of new magma at repeated intervals over the decades. A separate, more recent line of geologic analysis has argued that much of the ongoing uplift and earthquake activity may actually be driven less by fresh magma arriving from depth and more by aqueous fluid, essentially pressurized water and dissolved gas being released as an enormous, ancient reservoir of partially crystallized rhyolitic magma continues slowly solidifying deep underground, a process researchers call second boiling, releasing fluid under pressure that migrates upward and reactivates the same fault systems that originally formed when the caldera collapsed nearly 800,000 years ago. Whichever mechanism ultimately proves most accurate, and this remains a genuinely active area of scientific debate, both explanations agree on the fundamental point that matters most for anyone living or visiting this area. Something molten, or at minimum, something intensely hot and pressurized, continues moving and evolving beneath this landscape. Close enough to the surface to physically lift the ground, trigger repeated earthquake swarms, and poison soil miles away at Mammoth Mountain. Whichever mechanism ultimately proves most accurate, and this remains a genuinely active area of scientific debate, both explanations agree on the fundamental point that matters most for anyone living or visiting this area. Something molten, or at minimum something intensely hot and pressurized, continues moving and evolving beneath this landscape, close enough to the surface to physically lift the ground, trigger repeated earthquake swarms, and poison soil miles away at Mammoth Mountain. This scientific disagreement over mechanism, whether it's fresh magma or pressurized fluid from an old, slowly crystallizing reservoir, actually matters quite a bit for how researchers assess long-term hazard, and it's worth understanding why. If the uplift is being driven primarily by genuinely new magma working its way upward from deep in the crust, that would generally be considered a more concerning signal, since it implies an active supply of fresh molten material that could, over a long enough time frame, eventually feed a future eruption. If the uplift is instead being driven mainly by fluid released as an old, essentially stagnant body of magma slowly finishes crystallizing, that points toward a system that's gradually cooling and stabilizing over the very long term, even if it continues producing earthquakes and ground deformation for centuries along the way. Resolving this question definitively requires exactly the kind of sustained, decades-long geophysical monitoring the USGS has been conducting since 1982, which is part of why researchers treat every new earthquake swarm and every new increment of uplift as another valuable data point in an investigation that has already spanned most of a scientific career and shows no sign of concluding anytime soon. It's worth understanding why this kind of extended, multi-decade unrest at a large caldera doesn't necessarily mean an eruption is imminent, because it's a genuinely important distinction. USGS scientists have worked hard to communicate clearly to residents and visitors alike. At a smaller, more conventional volcano, the kind with a single central vent like Mount St. Helens, symptoms of unrest, earthquake swarms, gas emissions, ground swelling typically precede an actual eruption by a period measured in weeks or months. Large calderas like Long Valley behave according to an entirely different, much slower timescale. Symptoms of unrest at a system this size can persist for decades or even centuries without ever culminating in an eruption at all, simply because the sheer volume of material and the depth of the magmatic system involved operate on a fundamentally different physical scale than a smaller, more conventional volcanic cone. This is precisely why USGS scientists have been careful, consistently, over more than 4 decades of monitoring, to frame Long Valley's unrest as exactly that, ongoing unrest worth taking seriously and monitoring continuously, rather than a specific, imminent eruption warning. That framing matters enormously for how the roughly 8,000 full-time residents of Mammoth Lakes and the well over 1 million annual visitors who come to ski, hike, and vacation in the area actually live alongside this volcano day to day. Local governments and USGS scientists have worked together for decades on what researchers studying the communication challenge here have described as a genuinely difficult ongoing task, explaining a slow-moving, scientifically nuanced hazard to a population that understandably wants either a clear you're safe or clear you're in danger, when the actual scientific reality sits somewhere in a far more complicated middle ground. Field trips led by USGS scientists directly for local residents and officials have proven to be one of the more effective tools for building genuine understanding, giving people the chance to see the tree kill zones, the fault traces, and the deformation monitoring stations in person, rather than encountering this information only through alarming headlines or, worse, Only after a tragedy like the 2006 ski patrol deaths forces the issue into public awareness all at once. The same long-running tension between scientific caution and public reassurance plays out today in how emergency planners across Mono County approach volcanic hazard planning more broadly. Long Valley's official hazard response plan outlines a graduated series of alert levels, mirroring the kind of tiered system used at volcanoes across the Cascades and elsewhere, designed specifically to give officials and residents a clear, calibrated sense of when routine background monitoring might be escalating towards something requiring genuine public action, evacuation planning, road closures, or expanded exclusion zones around specific hazard sites. That plan exists precisely because a system capable of 40-plus years of measurable unrest without erupting could, in principle, also be capable of escalating toward an actual eruption with a warning period that, even in the most optimistic scenarios, researchers expect would still only provide weeks to months of clear advanced notice once a genuine eruptive sequence actually began, a dramatically shorter runway than the 4 decades of slower background unrest the region has experienced so far. The monitoring infrastructure built out to track all of this has grown considerably more sophisticated since the bare-bones seismometer network installed in 1982. Today, the USGS and its partners maintain a dense array of continuously recording GPS stations across the caldera, capable of detecting ground movement down to fractions of an inch, alongside borehole strain meters, gas monitoring stations, and a comprehensive seismic network that feeds data in real time to the California Volcano Observatory. This isn't a system scientists check in on periodically. It's continuous, 24 hours a day, specifically because a caldera capable of the kind of sudden earthquake swarms Long Valley produced in 1980 needs monitoring infrastructure, sensitive enough to catch a meaningful change quickly, whether that change turns out to be another unremarkable swarm of small earthquakes or, in some far less likely future scenario, the genuine early precursors of renewed volcanic activity. The caldera has also demonstrated a genuinely strange capacity to be shaken by earthquakes that strike hundreds of miles away, adding yet another layer of complexity to how scientists monitor this system. The 1992 Landers earthquake and the 2002 magnitude 7. 9. Denali Fault earthquake in Alaska both triggered measurable swarms of small earthquakes within Long Valley caldera itself, despite occurring at enormous distances from the caldera. The Denali event alone triggered roughly 60 small earthquakes within the caldera, a phenomenon known as remote triggering, where seismic waves traveling through the Earth from a distant, unrelated earthquake can destabilize an already stressed, fluid-rich volcanic system enough to set off its own localized seismic response. This kind of remote sensitivity is itself a data point scientists use to infer just how close to a critical stress threshold parts of this system may currently be sitting, since a caldera in a more stable, deeply dormant state would be far less likely to respond visibly to seismic waves originating 1,000 miles away. So here's the genuinely uncomfortable part of this story, the part that goes beyond even the tragic, well-documented deaths already linked to this system. Every visible symptom scientists have used to track this unrest, the ground uplift, the earthquake swarms, the gas emissions that killed people at Horseshoe Lake, they're not separate hazards happening to coincide at the same location. They are different expressions of the exact same underlying process, a genuinely massive volcanic system that has never fully gone, dormant since the 1980s, continuing to evolve in ways scientists still don't fully agree on the mechanics of, sitting directly beneath a town, a ski resort, and well over 1 million annual visitors who mostly have no idea any of this is happening beneath their feet at all. The gas that's already proven lethal isn't some isolated quirk of one specific mountain. It's the most direct physical evidence available that whatever caused the ground to rise nearly 3 feet since 1980 is still down there, still active, and still finding new ways to reach the surface. That's the real, full scope of what's actually happening beneath one of California's most beloved mountain resorts, not a single contained hazard you could fence off and warn people about, but an entire slowly evolving volcanic system whose most visible, most human consequence so far has been an invisible gas that's already taken lives, sitting on top of a magmatic engine that has kept the ground rising in fits and starts for well over 4 decades and counting. Scientists continue watching the system as closely as any volcanic hazard in the country, not because an eruption is believed to be imminent, but because a system capable of measurable, sustained uplift for this long deserves exactly that level of sustained attention. Stay with this channel because we'll keep tracking every new study and every new monitoring update coming out of this remarkable, still restless corner of the Sierra Nevada. And this is exactly the kind of story where the ground literally has more to say than most people realize.